My son Marcus and his family left me standing outside in a thunderstorm for 3 hours while they went to dinner, and when I called through the window, his wife Jessica just shrugged and said, "Maybe next time you'll remember your keys." That night, while my clothes were still drying, I made a decision that would change everything. Within 2 months, Marcus was begging me to move back in, but by then I owned the house, controlled their finances, and held the deed to their children's future. Now, Jessica wishes she'd opened that door. Marcus regrets choosing his wife over his mother, but me? I've never felt more powerful, and I've never slept better at night. Before we begin, make sure to like and subscribe and tell me in the comments, have you ever had family treat you like you were invisible? Share your story below, because today you're going to learn that sometimes the people who dismiss you are about to discover exactly how much they needed you. This story is about the Wednesday when I learned that 43 years of devotion to my family meant absolutely nothing when convenience was on the line. When I discovered that the son I'd raised alone after his father died had married a woman who saw me as nothing more than free childcare and an inconvenience to be managed. My name is Eleanor Hartwell, and for the past 5 years, I'd been living in the guest house behind my son Marcus's home in Willowbrook Heights, a quiet suburb about 20 miles outside of Portland. The arrangement had seemed perfect when Marcus first suggested it. I could maintain my independence while being close enough to help with my grandchildren, 8-year-old Sophie and 12-year-old Jake. After my husband Robert died and my arthritis made maintaining my old 2-story house increasingly difficult, moving to the guest house felt like the ideal solution for everyone. What I didn't realize was that perfect for everyone actually meant convenient for Marcus and Jessica when they needed a babysitter and invisible when they didn't. Let me tell you about the life I'd built before I became the forgotten woman in the backyard cottage. I met Robert Hartwell when I was 19, working as a secretary at Cascadia Insurance Company in downtown Portland. Robert was 25, a junior claims adjuster with kind eyes and a laugh that could fill a room. We married 2 years later in a small ceremony at St. Mary's Church, with dreams of filling a house with children and building a life that would matter. Robert and I tried for children for 8 years before Marcus finally arrived. 8 years. Of disappointment, medical tests, specialists, and the kind of hope that breaks your heart a little more each month. When Marcus was born on a snowy February morning in 1979, I thought I understood what miracles were. He was perfect, 10 fingers, 10 toes, and a cry that announced his presence to the world with absolute confidence. For the first 6 years of Marcus's life, we were the kind of family you see in old photographs, genuinely happy, secure in our love for each other, planning for a future that stretched out before us like a promise. Robert had been promoted to senior claims manager. I was working part-time at the local library, and Marcus was the kind of bright, curious child who made other parents smile when they watched him explore the world with fearless enthusiasm. Then, Robert had his first heart attack at 37. The doctors said it was genetic. Robert's father had died of heart disease at 42, and his grandfather before that. They said with medication, diet changes, and stress management, Robert could live a normal life. They said a lot of things that turned out to be optimistic rather than accurate. Robert lived for 8 more years after that first heart attack, but they weren't the same years we'd planned. His energy declined gradually. His work became increasingly stressful as he struggled to keep up with demands that had once seemed manageable, and the medical bills began to accumulate despite our insurance coverage. I took on more hours at the library, then found a second job working evenings at Henderson's accounting firm, doing data entry and filing for small businesses. Marcus was 14 when Robert died of his third and final heart attack on a Tuesday morning in October while I was at work and Marcus was at school. The neighbor, Mrs. Chen, found Robert in our backyard, where he'd been raking leaves, and apparently decided to sit down for a moment that became forever. The grief was like drowning in slow motion. But Marcus needed me to function, needed me to maintain some version of normal in a world that had suddenly become unpredictable and scary. So I functioned. I worked my 2 jobs, maintained our house, helped Marcus with homework, attended his baseball games, and pretended that the crushing loneliness of sleeping in a bed that had once held 2 people wasn't slowly eating me alive. Marcus thrived despite everything. He was valedictorian of his high school class, earned a full scholarship to Oregon State University, and graduated with a degree in business administration and a job offer from a respected logistics company. He was everything Robert and I had dreamed he could become: successful, confident, ready to build the kind of life we'd started together, but hadn't lived long enough to finish. When Marcus married Jessica Chen, no relation to our old neighbor, I was thrilled. Jessica was beautiful, educated, from a good family that owned a small chain of restaurants in the Portland area. She had a business degree from University of Portland and plans to start her own consulting company. More importantly, she made Marcus laugh the way Robert used to make me laugh, and I thought I was watching my son find the same kind of love that had sustained Robert and me through everything life had thrown at us. The wedding was beautiful. 200 guests at the Willowbrook Country Club, flowers that cost more than I'd spent on my entire wedding, and a reception that was featured in the local society pages. I was proud to be the mother of the groom, grateful that Marcus had found someone who would love and support him the way he deserved. I should have paid more attention to the guest list. Jessica's side of the church was packed with family, friends, college roommates, and business associates. Marcus's side had me: 3 of his college friends, 2 co-workers, and several empty rows that reminded everyone present that Marcus came from a smaller, less connected world than his bride. I should have noticed that during the reception, Jessica's mother, Linda, introduced me to people as Marcus's mother, the librarian, while she introduced her own friends and family with detailed descriptions of their accomplishments and social connections. I should have realized that when Jessica talked about their future plans, those plans never included considerations for aging parents or family obligations beyond the immediate nuclear family they intended to create. But I was happy for Marcus, grateful that he'd found love, and optimistic that Jessica would grow to appreciate the close relationship Marcus and I had always shared. I thought time and familiarity would help Jessica understand that I wasn't competing with her for Marcus's affection. I was offering to support the family they were building together. The first few years of their marriage seemed to prove me right. Jessica was polite and friendly, including me in holiday celebrations and birthday parties. When Sophie was born, Jessica seemed genuinely grateful for my help during those difficult first months, when sleep deprivation and new parent anxiety made every day feel like an endurance test. I spent countless hours rocking Sophie when she had colic, preparing meals for the exhausted new parents, and doing laundry so Jessica could focus on bonding with her daughter. When Jake arrived 4 years later, the pattern repeated. I was the reliable grandmother who could be counted on for emergency babysitting, meal preparation, and the kind of practical support that made new parenthood manageable. Jessica praised my help to her friends, calling me a godsend and the kind of mother-in-law every woman dreams of having. But somewhere along the way, my helpfulness transformed from appreciated support to expected service. The thank yous became less frequent. The invitations to family decisions became rare. The assumption that I would be available whenever needed became absolute. When Marcus suggested I sell my house and move to the guest house behind their new home in Willowbrook Heights, it seemed like a natural progression. My old house was becoming difficult to maintain, the neighborhood was changing in ways that made me feel isolated, and the opportunity to be closer to Sophie and Jake was appealing. The guest house was comfortable, a converted garage apartment with a living room, bedroom, kitchenette, and small bathroom. It had its own entrance, a tiny garden space, and enough privacy that I could maintain my independence while being available to help with the grandchildren. "It'll be perfect, Mom," Marcus had said as he showed me through the space. "You'll have your own place, but you'll be close enough that the kids can visit whenever they want. And Jessica and I will have peace of mind knowing you're nearby if anything happens. What Marcus didn't mention was that anything happens would come to include Jessica's yoga classes, book club meetings, shopping trips, coffee dates, doctor appointments, hair appointments, and any other activity that required childcare but didn't warrant the expense of hiring an actual babysitter. What Jessica didn't mention was that she'd come to see the guest house less as my home and more as a convenient annexation to their main house, a place where the free childcare lived, available for summons whenever needed. For 5 years, I'd been the perfect grandmother. I never complained when Jessica called at the last minute asking if I could watch the kids. I never pointed out that the emergencies requiring my help often turned out to be social activities. That could have been scheduled around Marcus's availability. I never mentioned that my own plans, library volunteer work, senior center activities, visits with my few remaining friends, were consistently interrupted for babysitting requests that were presented as favors I was doing for the family rather than services I was providing for free. I told myself that this was what grandmothers did. That being needed by my family was a blessing, even when the need felt more like exploitation. That the joy of watching Sophie and Jake grow up was worth the gradual erosion of my own autonomy and social life. I told myself a lot of things that turned out to be lies I was telling myself to avoid confronting the truth about my situation. The truth was that I'd become the family's unpaid domestic worker, available at their convenience and invisible when my presence wasn't required. The truth was that Jessica had never seen me as a person with my own needs, interests, and right to respect. I was a resource to be managed, like the lawn service or the housekeeping company she hired for deep cleaning twice a month. The truth was that Marcus, the son I'd raised alone and supported through every challenge of his youth, had gradually adopted his wife's view of me as a convenience rather than a person worthy of consideration and basic courtesy. But I didn't fully understand these truths until the Wednesday that changed everything. The Wednesday when 43 years of devotion and 5 years of convenient availability collided with a thunderstorm and a locked door and a family who'd forgotten I was human enough to deserve shelter from the rain. The morning that would transform me from Eleanor the grateful grandmother to Eleanor the force to be reckoned with started like any other Wednesday. Marcus was returning from a 3-day business trip to Seattle. Jessica had mentioned something about a client meeting, and I was responsible for getting Sophie and Jake ready for school and walking them to the bus stop. I loved those morning routines with my grandchildren. Sophie was 8, with Marcus's dark hair and Robert's gentle curiosity about everything around her. She collected interesting rocks, drew pictures of fantastical creatures, and asked questions that reminded me why I'd loved working at the library. She approached the world like a book full of stories waiting to be discovered. Jake was 12, all elbows and attitude in the way of boys approaching adolescence. He was testing boundaries, rolling his eyes at adult instructions, and trying to establish his independence while still needing more guidance than he was willing to admit. He reminded me of Marcus at that age, before Robert's death had forced him to grow up faster than any child should have to. That morning, Sophie wanted to show me a caterpillar she'd found in the garden, and Jake needed help finding his science project, which was due that day and which his parents had forgotten to help him complete. I spent an hour helping Jake put together a presentation about plant growth, while Sophie carefully relocated her caterpillar to a safer location away from foot traffic. "Grandma Eleanor," Sophie said as we walked to the bus stop, "are you coming to my school play on Friday? I'm playing a tree and I have a costume that Mom helped me make." "Of course I'll be there," I said, making a mental note to ask Jessica about the time and location. "I wouldn't miss seeing you as a tree." "Jake's in the play too," Sophie continued, skipping along beside me. "He's playing a rock." "I'm not playing a rock," Jake said with the exasperated tone he'd perfected for correcting his younger sister. "I'm operating the sound effects. It's a very important technical role." I smiled, watching them interact with the mixture of affection and irritation that defined sibling relationships. These moments, walking to the bus stop, helping with homework, listening to their stories about school friends and playground drama, these were the reasons I'd agreed to live in the guest house. These were the relationships that made the inconveniences and lack of consideration from Marcus and Jessica seem manageable. After the children caught their bus, I returned to the main house to tidy up the breakfast dishes and start a load of laundry. Jessica had asked me to handle these tasks before leaving for her client meeting, and I'd agreed without thinking about it, the way I agreed to most requests that came from the main house. The house was quiet in the way that houses are when their primary occupants have left for the day. I could hear the dishwasher running, the grandfather clock in the living room marking time, and the distant sound of traffic from the main road. It was peaceful, and I found myself humming as I folded Jake's school shirts and sorted Sophie's art supplies that had migrated to the kitchen table. At 11 o'clock, I made myself a cup of tea and settled into the living room with a book I'd been trying to finish for 2 weeks. One of the advantages of living in the guest house was that I had access to the main house during the day when Jessica was out, and the living room had better lighting for reading than my small apartment. I was deep into chapter 12 when I heard car doors slamming in the driveway. Through the front window, I could see Marcus unloading his suitcase from his sedan, while Jessica emerged from her SUV carrying shopping bags that definitely hadn't come from a client meeting. They were home earlier than expected, but that wasn't unusual. Marcus often finished business trips ahead of schedule, and Jessica's meetings were frequently shorter than originally planned. I marked my place in the book and stood up to greet them, but before I could reach the front door, I heard Jessica talking to Marcus in the driveway. Perfect timing. Caroline called this morning about dinner at that new French place downtown. She's only in town until tomorrow, and I haven't seen her since her wedding. Sounds great, Marcus replied. Should we pick up the kids from school early? Make it a family thing? Actually, I was thinking just adults tonight. Caroline's going through a difficult divorce, and she needs to talk through some things that aren't really appropriate for children. Plus, the restaurant has a very sophisticated atmosphere, not really kid-friendly. I moved to the window and watched them continue their conversation by Marcus's car. Jessica was animated, excited about seeing her college roommate. Marcus looked tired from travel but was nodding along with her plans. What about Mom? Marcus asked, glancing toward the guest house. Should we invite her to join us? Jessica's expression shifted slightly, and I saw her glance toward the main house where she undoubtedly assumed I was still cleaning up from the morning routine. Oh, you know how these college reunions are, Jessica said with a dismissive wave. Lots of inside jokes and shared memories. It would probably be boring for her. Besides, someone should be here when the kids get home from school. Marcus nodded, apparently satisfied with this reasoning. You're right. Mom probably has her own plans anyway. They walked toward the house, still discussing restaurant reservations and babysitting arrangements for the evening. I stepped back from the window, feeling a familiar mixture of disappointment and resignation. It wasn't the first time I'd been excluded from social activities, and it probably wouldn't be the last. Jessica was right that I didn't know her college friends, and someone did need to be available for Sophie and Jake after school. But what bothered me was the casual way they'd decided my evening without consulting me. The assumption that I had no plans of my own, no interests or activities that might conflict with their needs for free childcare. The easy dismissal of my potential contribution to an adult dinner conversation, as if my presence would somehow diminish their enjoyment of the evening. I was still processing these feelings when I heard the front door open and close, followed by the sound of Jessica's voice talking on her phone. Caroline, it's perfect. Marcus just got back from his trip and we can meet you at 7. No childcare issues. Marcus's mother lives here, so she'll handle the kids. Yes, it's very convenient. That's what I'd become. A convenience that lived in the backyard and could be counted on to handle whatever responsibilities Marcus and Jessica didn't want to manage themselves. I gathered my book and teacup, planning to return to the guest. house and avoid any awkward encounters about evening babysitting duties I'd apparently already been assigned. But as I reached for the front door handle, I heard Jessica's phone conversation take an unexpected turn. "Actually, let me call you back in 5 minutes. I want to check with the restaurant about making the reservation for 4 instead of 2. "What? Oh, Marcus didn't mention we might bring someone. It's my sister-in-law, Rachel. She's visiting from California this week, and I completely forgot." I froze with my hand on the door handle. Rachel was Marcus's cousin, not Jessica's sister-in-law, and she lived in Phoenix, not California. But more importantly, I hadn't heard anything about Rachel visiting, and I certainly hadn't seen any preparations for out-of-town guests. "Yes, Rachel's staying with us through the weekend," Jessica continued, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who'd convinced herself that a lie told confidently enough became truth. "She's very sophisticated, travels internationally for work. I think she and Caroline would really hit it off." I stood in the entryway, listening to Jessica fabricate an entire fictional person to avoid having to explain why she didn't want to include her mother-in-law in dinner plans. It wasn't just that I'd been excluded, it was that Jessica was going to extraordinary lengths to justify the exclusion, creating elaborate stories rather than simply acknowledging that she didn't want me there. The phone call continued for another few minutes, with Jessica providing increasingly detailed descriptions of the imaginary Rachel's career, personality, and travel schedule. By the time she hung up, she'd constructed an entire fictional evening that positioned her as a thoughtful hostess, including a sophisticated family member in an elegant dinner party. I slipped out the front door before Jessica could discover me, in the entryway, and walked back to the guest house with my mind spinning. The casual exclusion from dinner plans was irritating, but manageable. The assumption that I'd provide childcare without being asked was frustrating, but familiar. But the elaborate lie about a fictional dinner guest revealed something more troubling, about how Jessica saw me and our relationship. I wasn't just an inconvenience to be managed. I was an embarrassment to be hidden. Someone whose presence needed to be explained away, whose existence complicated Jessica's presentation of herself as a sophisticated woman with interesting social connections. I spent the afternoon in the guest house, reading my book and trying to process what I'd overheard. By the time Sophie and Jake returned from school, I'd convinced myself that I was overreacting. Jessica was excited about seeing an old friend, and it was natural for her to want the evening to focus on catching up without the complications of extended family dynamics. I was being oversensitive, reading too much into casual conversation. Sophie and Jake arrived at the guest house at 3:30, full of stories about their school day and excited to show me their completed homework assignments. Jake had received an A on the science project we'd worked on that morning, and Sophie had been chosen to help with costumes for the upcoming school play. "Dad's home," Sophie announced, having spotted Marcus's car in the driveway. "Can we go? See him before we start homework?" "Of course," I said, walking them across the backyard to the main house. "I'm sure he missed you while he was traveling." Marcus was in the kitchen, still wearing his business suit, but with his tie loosened and his jacket draped over a chair. He looked tired, but pleased to see the children, gathering them both into a hug that reminded me of the affectionate father he'd always been. "How are my favorite kids?" he asked, ruffling Jake's hair and lifting Sophie onto his lap. "Did you miss your old dad while I was gone?" "We missed you," Sophie said seriously. "But Grandma Eleanor took good care of us. She helped Jake with his science project, and she found a new home for my caterpillar." "That sounds like Grandma Eleanor," Marcus said, smiling at me over Sophie's head. "Always taking care of everyone." Jessica appeared in the kitchen, having changed from her shopping clothes into an elegant dress that suggested she was already preparing for the evening out. She kissed Marcus hello and smiled at the children, but I noticed she avoided making eye contact with me. "How was your meeting?" Marcus asked Jessica, apparently having forgotten the shopping bags I'd seen her carrying earlier. "Very productive," Jessica said smoothly. We finalized the social media strategy for the Thompson restaurant renovation. It's going to be a major project. I said nothing, but I made a mental note that Jessica's ability to construct fictional narratives extended beyond phone conversations with college friends. That's great, Marcus said. And I have some good news too. The Seattle project was approved, which means a significant bonus and probably a promotion to regional director. That's wonderful, Jessica said, her excitement genuine this time. We should celebrate. Actually, that works out perfectly, Marcus said. I was thinking we could take everyone out to dinner tonight. Somewhere nice to mark the occasion. I felt a flutter of hope. Maybe I'd misunderstood the earlier conversation. Maybe the dinner with Caroline had been canceled, or maybe Marcus's celebration would include the whole family. Oh, Jessica said, her smile faltering slightly. I actually already made plans with Caroline for tonight. You remember Caroline Martinez, my college roommate? She's visiting from out of town, and this is the only night she's available. Marcus nodded, though I could see disappointment cross his face. That's fine. We can celebrate this weekend instead. Will Mom be joining you and Caroline? Well, it's really more of a college reunion thing, Jessica said, using the same dismissive tone I'd heard in the driveway. Lots of reminiscing about people and experiences that wouldn't really be interesting to anyone else. I'm sure Mom wouldn't mind, Marcus said. She's always gracious about adapting to social situations. The thing is, Jessica continued, her voice taking on a slightly strained quality, Caroline is going through a difficult divorce, and she specifically asked for just close friends tonight. You know how it is when someone needs to process personal issues. Too many people can make it harder to open up. Marcus nodded again, apparently accepting this explanation. That makes sense. Mom will understand. I stood in the kitchen, listening to this exchange and marveling at Jessica's ability to create reasonable-sounding justifications for excluding me from activities I hadn't even known I was being excluded from. Caroline's imaginary need for an intimate conversation about her divorce provided the perfect cover for Jessica's desire to avoid including her mother-in-law in social activities. What about the kids? Marcus asked. Should I stay home with them? Oh, that's not necessary, Jessica said quickly. Your mother can handle the evening routine. She always does such a good job with bedtime stories and homework supervision, and there it was. The assumption that I would provide childcare, presented as a compliment about my competence rather than an acknowledgement that my evening plans hadn't been considered at all. Is that okay with you, Mom? Marcus asked, finally looking at me directly. Of course, I said, because what else could I say? That I'd prefer to be included in the celebration of his promotion. That being relegated to childcare duty while they enjoyed an adults-only dinner made me feel like hired help rather than family. That I was tired of being taken for granted. You're the best, Marcus said, giving me a grateful smile. I don't know what we'd do without you. I smiled back, because that's what grandmothers do. We smile and say, of course, and make everything easier for the adults who have more important things to do than consider our feelings or include us in their lives beyond our utility as babysitters and household help. After Marcus and Jessica left for their dinner celebration that I wasn't sophisticated enough to attend, I spent the evening with Sophie and Jake, helping them with homework and listening to them practice their lines for the school play. They were good kids, sweet and affectionate in the way children are when they haven't yet learned to take the adults in their lives for granted. But as I tucked them into bed and turned off the lights in the main house, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted that day. The casual exclusion, the fictional dinner guest, the elaborate justifications, they all pointed to a truth I'd been avoiding for months. I wasn't a valued member of this family. I was a convenience, a resource to be managed and deployed as needed. My feelings, my social needs, my right to be included in family celebrations, none of that mattered as much as my availability to provide free childcare and household support. I walked back to the guest house through the quiet backyard, thinking about the life I'd built around making myself indispensable to people who saw my indispensability as their entitlement rather than my gift. I had no idea that tomorrow would bring a thunderstorm that would wash away the last of my illusions about my place in this family and reveal exactly what Marcus and Jessica really thought about the woman who'd spent 5 years making their lives easier at the expense of her own dignity. I had no idea that by tomorrow night, I'd finally understand the difference between being needed and being valued, and that understanding would change everything. Thursday morning arrived with the kind of gray sky that promised rain before noon. I woke up in the guest house at 6 a.m. as I had every weekday for the past 5 years, and went through my usual routine of preparing for another day of invisible service to a family that had forgotten I was more than a convenience. The morning started exactly like the previous day, except this time I was acutely aware of every small assumption and casual dismissal that I'd been accepting as normal for far too long. Jessica's text arrived at 6:15 a.m., before I'd even finished my coffee. "Eleanor, can you handle morning routine again? Client emergency? Thanks, Jay." No, please. No, would you mind? No acknowledgement that she was asking me to rearrange my own plans to accommodate her schedule. Just the assumption that my time was always available and my agreement was guaranteed. I texted back, "Of course," because that's what I always did. But as I walked across the dew-covered grass to the main house, I found myself wondering when I'd become someone whose own needs never mattered enough to be considered. Sophie and Jake were already awake, sitting at the kitchen table in their pajamas and arguing about who got the last of the Lucky Charms cereal. The kitchen showed signs of Jessica's hasty departure: coffee cup in the sink, makeup compact open on the counter, a piece of toast with one bite taken out of it abandoned on a plate. "Where's Mom?" Sophie asked as I poured orange juice into her glass. "She said she was going to help me practice my lines for the play." "She had to leave early for work," I said, making a mental note to ask Jessica about the play schedule again. "But I can help you practice after breakfast." "She's always leaving early," Jake grumbled, stabbing his cereal with unnecessary force. "She promised she'd drive me to Tommy's house this afternoon, but I bet she forgets again." I looked at Jake more carefully, noticing the disappointment that he was trying to hide behind 12-year-old bravado. "What's happening at Tommy's house?" "He got the new PlayStation game that everyone's talking about. His mom said I could come over and play it, but only if someone can drive me there and back. Mom said she would, but—" Jake shrugged, the gesture carrying more resignation than any child should have to feel. "I can drive you," I said automatically. "What time do you need to be there?" "Really?" Jake's face lit up with genuine surprise, as if the idea that someone would follow through on a promise was unexpected. "Tommy's mom said any time after 3 p.m. But don't you have your old people stuff to do?" My old people stuff. That's how Jake had learned to categorize my activities. The library volunteer work, the senior center book club, the weekly coffee dates with my friend Helen from my old neighborhood. Activities that Jessica had taught him to see as optional. Obligations that could be easily rearranged when family needs arose. "I'll check my schedule," I said, though we both knew I'd make whatever adjustments were necessary to ensure Jake didn't experience another disappointment at the hands of adults who treated their commitments to children as suggestions rather than promises. As I helped Sophie find her backpack and made sure Jake had his completed science project, I reflected on how my role in this family had evolved over the 5 years I'd been living in the guest house. I'd started as a helpful grandmother, someone who could provide occasional support and enjoy regular time with her grandchildren. But gradually, I'd become the default solution to every scheduling conflict, every last-minute emergency, every situation where Marcus and Jessica's convenience was more important than anyone else's plans. The transition had been so gradual that I hadn't noticed it happening. Jessica would ask if I could watch the kids just this once because her yoga class had been rescheduled. Marcus would mention that he had to work late and wonder if I could handle dinner and homework supervision. The requests were always presented as favors I was doing for the family, temporary solutions to unexpected problems. But just this once had become, whenever we need you, and temporary solutions had become permanent arrangements. I'd become so invested in being useful, so afraid of being seen as a burden, that I'd gradually surrendered every boundary I'd once maintained around my own time and autonomy. Standing in Marcus and Jessica's kitchen, making sure their children had everything they needed for school while Jessica dealt with another client emergency, I realized that I couldn't remember the last time anyone in this family had asked what I wanted to do, or whether their requests were convenient for me, or what I might need from them in return for all the support I provided. The walk to the bus stop with Sophie and Jake was quiet, except for Sophie's chatter about her upcoming performance as a tree. She was excited about her costume, worried about remembering her lines, and proud that she'd been chosen for a speaking role in what she called the most important play in the history of Willowbrook Elementary. "Will you definitely be there to watch me?" she asked for the third time, skipping along beside me as we approached the corner where the school bus would arrive. "I'll definitely be there," I promised, though I realized I still didn't know when or where the play was happening. "You're going to be the best tree that ever appeared on stage." "Grandma Eleanor," Sophie said, suddenly serious, "why doesn't Mom come to walk us to the bus stop anymore? She used to before you moved here." The question caught me off guard, partly because it revealed that Sophie had noticed the gradual shift in family responsibilities, and partly because I didn't have a good answer that wouldn't require explaining adult relationship dynamics to an 8-year-old. "Your mom has a lot of work responsibilities," I said carefully, "but she loves you very much, and she's always interested in hearing about your day when she gets home." "I guess," Sophie said, though she didn't sound entirely convinced. "But sometimes I miss the way things used to be, when she would walk with us and we could tell her about stuff before school instead of trying to remember everything later. From the mouths of babes." Sophie had articulated something I'd been struggling to understand, that my increasing involvement in daily family routines had somehow decreased Jessica's participation rather than supplementing it. Instead of providing additional support that allowed Jessica to be more present for special moments, my availability had enabled Jessica to delegate more and more parental responsibilities to someone else. The school bus arrived with its usual fanfare of squeaking brakes and excited children. I hugged Sophie and Jake goodbye, reminded them both about after-school plans, and watched the bus disappear around the corner, carrying them toward a day of learning and friendship and the kind of normal childhood experiences that I was working hard to protect. Walking back to the house alone, I noticed details about the neighborhood that I usually missed during the busy morning routine. The Hendersons' rose garden was struggling, probably due to the recent dry spell. The Patels had painted their front door a cheerful yellow that brightened the whole street. Mrs. Morrison from 3 houses down was outside collecting her newspaper, and she waved at me with the friendly recognition of someone who'd seen me walking children to the bus stop every morning for years. "How are those grandchildren of yours, Eleanor?" Mrs. Morrison called out. "They're growing up so fast." "They're wonderful," I called back. "Sophie's in a school play this week, and Jake just aced a science project." "You must be so proud," Mrs. Morrison said. "It's lovely to see how involved you are in their lives. Not all grandparents are so dedicated." I smiled and waved, continuing toward the house while thinking about Mrs. Morrison's casual assumption that my involvement with Sophie and Jake was a choice rather than an expectation. From the outside, my daily routines with the children probably looked like the picture of an engaged, loving grandmother who chose to prioritize family time above other activities. Mrs. Morrison couldn't see the text messages that arrived at all hours asking if I could adjust my plans to accommodate Jessica's schedule. She couldn't hear the conversations where my own commitments were dismissed as easily changeable because you're retired, so you have flexibility. She couldn't witness the way my offers to help had transformed into assumptions that I would help, regardless of what else I might want to do with my time. But as I approached the main house, I saw Marcus's car in the driveway again, which meant he'd returned from dropping Jessica at her office. This was unusual. Marcus typically left for his own office by 7:30 a.m., and it was already past 8 o'clock. I found Marcus in the kitchen, drinking coffee and reading something on his laptop with the focused concentration he usually reserved for important work projects. He looked up when I entered, his expression shifting from business-focused to the slightly guilty look he got when he was about to ask me for another favor. "Morning, Mom," he said, closing the laptop and giving me his full attention. "How did the kids seem today?" I know Jake was worried about that science project. "He got an A-, I said, refilling my coffee cup from the pot Marcus had made. He was pretty proud of himself. "That's great," Marcus said, though I could tell his mind was on something else. "Listen, Mom, I need to ask you about something. I know you probably have your own plans today, but something came up with work." Here it was. Another request disguised as consideration for my schedule. Another assumption that my time was infinitely flexible while everyone else's commitments were sacred and unchangeable. "What do you need?" I asked, settling into the chair across from him and preparing myself for whatever inconvenience was about to be presented as a favor I could do for the family. "The Seattle promotion came with some complications," Marcus began, his tone taking on the careful quality he used when he was trying to make a significant imposition sound reasonable. "They want me to fly back up there today to finalize some details about the transition timeline. It's completely last minute, but it could affect the entire trajectory of my career." I waited, knowing there was more coming. "The thing is, Jessica has that major client presentation this afternoon. The one for the Thompson restaurant chain that could really establish her consulting business. She's been preparing for weeks, and she can't reschedule. So you need me to handle pickup from school and the evening routine," I said, stating the obvious conclusion to save us both the pretense that this was actually a question. "I know it's a lot to ask," Marcus said quickly, "especially with such short notice. But you're the only person we trust with Sophie and Jake, and Jessica's presentation could really be a game changer for her business." There it was, the familiar refrain that positioned my inconvenience as evidence of their trust in me, rather than acknowledgement that they'd structured their lives around the assumption that I was always available to solve their scheduling conflicts. "What time is your flight?" I asked, because what else could I say? That I'd been looking forward to finishing my book and maybe calling Helen to reschedule the coffee date I'd already postponed twice for similar family emergencies? That I was tired of being the automatic solution to every conflict between their professional ambitions and their parental responsibilities? 2:30, Marcus said, relief evident in his voice. "I'll be back tomorrow evening, and Jessica should be home by 7 tonight. It's really just a few hours of overlap." A few hours of overlap. That's how Marcus characterized taking complete responsibility for his children's after-school care, dinner preparation, homework supervision, bath time, and bedtime routine. A few hours, as if the complexity and energy required to manage all those tasks was negligible because I'd been doing it regularly for 5 years. "I already promised Jake I'd drive him to his friend Tommy's house this afternoon," I said, testing whether Marcus had any awareness of the plans his children had made or the commitments I'd accepted on the family's behalf. Marcus looked blank. For a moment, clearly having no idea what I was talking about. "Tommy?" Jake's friend from school. Jessica was supposed to drive him there today, but apparently that was before this client presentation became so important. Jake's been looking forward to it all week. "Oh," Marcus said, processing this information as if it was the first he'd heard of his son's social plans. "Well, you can still take him, right? Tommy's house isn't far from here." And there it was. The casual assumption that I would simply absorb all the inconveniences created by their last-minute schedule changes, with no consideration for how those changes might affect my own day or energy levels. "Of course," I said, because I wasn't going to disappoint Jake again. even if it meant spending my entire day responding to other people's poor planning. "What time will Jessica be home?" "She said 7. But you know how these presentations can run long," Marcus replied, already shifting his attention back to his laptop. "She'll call if it's going to be significantly later. Significantly later." Another elastic concept that could mean anything from 30 minutes to 3 hours, depending on how Jessica's meeting progressed and whether she decided to extend the business discussion into a networking dinner. I spent the next hour helping Marcus organize his unexpected trip while he made phone calls to his office, his hotel, and the car service that would take him to the airport. I found his garment bag, made sure he had everything he needed for an overnight stay, and confirmed the details about school pickup and Jake's social plans. "You're a lifesaver, Mom," Marcus said as he loaded his suitcase into his car. "I don't know what we'd do without you." That phrase again. "I don't know what we'd do without you." Always delivered with genuine gratitude, as if my constant availability was a generous gift rather than an expected service. As if they'd never had to find out what they'd do without me, because the possibility of my saying no had never been seriously considered. After Marcus left for the airport, I returned to the guest house and tried to salvage what was left of my original plans for the day. I'd been hoping to finish the mystery novel I'd been reading in bits and pieces for 2 weeks, maybe do some gardening in my small plot behind the guest house, and call Helen to confirm our coffee date for tomorrow. Instead, I spent the morning doing laundry and meal preparation for a family that would need dinner, clean clothes, and a smoothly functioning household when they returned from their respective professional obligations. I made Marcus's favorite pot roast for the slow cooker, folded the clean clothes that had been sitting in the laundry room for 3 days, and organized the kitchen so Jessica wouldn't have to deal with any household chaos after her important presentation. As I worked, I found myself thinking about the conversation I'd overheard the previous day, when Jessica had fabricated an entire fictional dinner guest rather than simply say she preferred not to include me in social plans. The memory stung more than I'd admitted to myself at the time, not just because of the exclusion, but because of what it revealed about how Jessica saw me. I wasn't someone whose feelings needed to be considered or whose inclusion might add value to a social gathering. I was someone whose presence required elaborate justification, whose very existence complicated Jessica's ability to present herself as a sophisticated woman with interesting friends and engaging conversation. The phone rang at 11:30, interrupting my increasingly dark thoughts about family dynamics and my place in them. "Eleanor?" Jessica's voice was tight with stress and barely controlled frustration. "I need a huge favor." Another favor. This was how every request began now, even though we both knew that my agreement was assumed rather than genuinely optional. "What's going on?" I asked, settling into the chair by my kitchen window and preparing for whatever crisis needed to be solved by my immediate availability. "The client presentation got moved up to 1 p.m. instead of 3 p.m., Jessica said, speaking quickly as if speed could minimize the magnitude of the imposition she was about to request. "Which means I need to leave here in 20 minutes and the kids get out early today for some teacher planning thing that I completely forgot about." Early dismissal. On the same day that Marcus was flying to Seattle and Jessica had her career-defining presentation, the kind of scheduling conflict that happened regularly in families with busy professional lives and active children, but which somehow always became my problem to solve. "What time do they get out?" I asked, mentally reorganizing my afternoon. "Around school pickup and child supervision." "Noon," Jessica said. "I know you probably have plans, but could you possibly pick them up and keep them until Marcus gets back tomorrow? I tried calling the after-school program, but they're closed. For staff training, keep them until Marcus gets back tomorrow." What had started as a few hours of overlap had suddenly become 24 hours of full-time childcare, including overnight supervision, with about 40 minutes' notice. "Jessica," I said carefully, "when you say until Marcus gets back tomorrow, what exactly does that mean for your evening plans?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. and I could practically hear Jessica calculating how much she could ask for, without triggering a conversation about boundaries that she clearly didn't want to have. Well, the presentation is supposed to end by 5 p.m., she said slowly. But if it goes well, the clients want to continue the discussion over dinner. It's the kind of opportunity I can't really turn down. So you might not be home until late tonight. It's possible. But Eleanor, this contract could really establish my business. It's not just about money. It's about building the kind of professional reputation that could support our family for years to come. There it was, the justification that positioned her professional ambitions as family benefits, rather than acknowledging that pursuing those ambitions required me to provide extensive unpaid childcare with no advance notice. What about tomorrow? I asked, because I needed to understand the full scope of what I was being asked to commit to. Tomorrow should be fine, Jessica said quickly. The kids have school and Marcus will be back by evening. It's really just tonight that might run long. Might run long. Another elastic phrase that could mean anything from 8 p.m. to midnight, depending on how networking opportunities developed, and whether Jessica decided that building professional relationships required extended social time with potential clients. I looked around my small kitchen, thinking about the pot roast I'd started for a family dinner that might not happen, the plans I'd already postponed, and the book I'd been trying to finish. For 2 weeks, I thought about Jake's excitement about visiting Tommy's house, and Sophie's nervous energy about her upcoming play performance, and the way both children seemed to expect disappointment more than reliability from the adults in their lives. Course, I said, because I wasn't going to punish Sophie and Jake for their parents' poor planning and competing priorities. I'll pick them up at noon. You're amazing, Jessica said, and I could hear her gathering papers and moving around what I assumed was her office. I'll make it up to you, I promise. Maybe we can plan a spa day or something when this project settles down. A spa day. The kind of vague future compensation that Jessica offered whenever she asked for significant favors, but which never seemed to materialize once the immediate crisis had passed. I'd been promised spa days, shopping trips, and special dinners for the past 5 years, but none of them had ever been scheduled because there was always another crisis, another opportunity, another situation that required my immediate availability. After Jessica hung up, I sat in my kitchen for several minutes, processing the magnitude of what I'd just agreed to. Overnight childcare with 4 hours notice, complete responsibility for children whose parents had both prioritized professional commitments over family logistics. Another evening of explaining to Sophie and Jake why their parents' work was more important than being present for ordinary Thursday night family time. But more than the immediate inconvenience, I was bothered by the casual way that Jessica had described the situation. The huge favor she needed wasn't really a favor. It was an expectation disguised as a request, presented with just enough urgency and professional justification to make refusal seem selfish and unreasonable. I was the automatic solution to every scheduling conflict, the default caregiver whenever Marcus and Jessica's ambitions created gaps in their parental responsibilities. My own needs, plans, and energy levels were never part of the equation, because everyone had learned to assume that my time was infinitely flexible and my availability was unconditional. At 11:45, I walked to my car to drive to Willowbrook Elementary for early pickup, wondering when I'd become someone whose entire life revolved around solving other people's problems. As I started the engine, I noticed storm clouds gathering on the western horizon, the kind of dark, heavy formations that promised serious rain before the day was over. I had no idea that those storm clouds were about to deliver more than just weather. I had no idea that the rain beginning to fall as I drove toward the school would become the backdrop for a revelation that would change everything about my relationship with this family. And I had no idea that by tonight, I would finally understand the difference between being helpful and being used, between being appreciated and being taken for granted, between being needed and being valued. The storm was coming, and it would wash away more than just the dust from Jessica's perfectly maintained garden. It would wash away the last of my illusions about unconditional family love and reveal the true cost of making myself indispensable to people who had learned to see my indispensability as their right rather than my gift. School pickup went smoothly, with Sophie chattering about her upcoming play and Jake excited about finally getting to visit Tommy's house. Neither child seemed particularly surprised that both parents had urgent work commitments that required my intervention, which suggested that this pattern of last-minute schedule changes and grandparent solutions had become their normal, rather than an exception. "Is Dad really coming back tomorrow?" Sophie asked as we drove away from the school. "Or is his work trip going to get longer like last time?" Last time. I made a mental note to ask Marcus about previous occasions when business travel had been extended unexpectedly, leaving Jessica and me to manage household and childcare responsibilities without his support. "He said tomorrow evening," I replied, though I realized that Sophie's question revealed a concerning pattern of unreliable commitments that I hadn't been fully aware of. "But you know how business trips can be unpredictable. That's what Mom always says," Jake added from the back seat. "That Dad's work trips are unpredictable, and Mom's client meetings are unpredictable, and pretty much everything is unpredictable except that you'll be there to take care of us." Jake's observation was delivered with the matter-of-fact tone of a 12-year-old stating an obvious truth, but it hit me like a physical blow. Even the children had noticed that I was the only reliable constant in their lives, the only adult whose commitments to them were never subject to professional demands or schedule changes. We stopped at Tommy's house first, and I spent 10 minutes talking with Tommy's mother about pickup arrangements while Jake disappeared into the basement to begin his anticipated gaming session. Tommy's mother was gracious and understanding about the last-minute transportation request, commenting that she was impressed by how involved I was in Jake's social life. "Not all grandparents are willing to be so flexible," she said as we confirmed that I'd return to pick up Jake at 6 p.m. "Jake is lucky to have someone who prioritizes his friendships and activities." Prioritizes. Another word that suggested choice rather than circumstance, as if my involvement in Jake's social life reflected my personal values rather than my default role as the family's transportation and childcare coordinator. After dropping Jake at Tommy's house, Sophie and I returned to the main house, where she wanted to practice her lines for the play, while I prepared an early dinner that could be easily reheated whenever Jessica finally returned from her networking opportunity. Sophie's play was a simple environmental story about trees, animals, and the importance of protecting nature. Her role as a wise old oak tree required her to deliver several speeches about the interconnectedness of forest life and the responsibility of humans to care for the environment. "The oak tree is the most important character," Sophie explained, as she positioned herself in the living room and struck a dramatic pose with her arms stretched wide like branches, "because she's been there the longest and understands how everything works together." "That sounds like a very important role," I said, settling into the chair where I could watch her practice. "What does the oak tree tell the other characters?" Sophie launched into her lines with the serious concentration of someone who understood the weight of her theatrical responsibilities. Her speech was about wisdom that comes from experience, about the importance of strong roots and flexible branches, about how the oldest trees provide shelter and support for newer growth. As I listened to her earnest delivery of lines about trees that gave without expecting return, that provided shelter without demanding recognition, that strengthened the entire forest through their quiet, consistent presence, I felt an uncomfortable recognition of my own situation. I was the oak tree. In this family, the reliable presence that provided support and stability, that bent without breaking under the demands placed on me, that prioritized the health of the whole family system over my own needs and growth. But unlike Sophie's wise oak tree, which was celebrated and honored for its contributions to the forest, I was invisible until needed, forgotten until the next crisis required my intervention. The irony wasn't lost on me that while I was helping my granddaughter practice lines about the value of trees that give unconditionally, I was simultaneously preparing dinner for a family that had forgotten I might want something in return for my own unconditional giving. At 4 p.m., the rain that had been threatening all day finally began in earnest. What started as scattered drops quickly intensified into a steady downpour that drummed against the windows and turned the backyard into a temporary lake. Sophie and I watched from the living room as water pooled in the garden and overflowed from gutters that needed cleaning. "It's really coming down," Sophie observed, pressing her nose against the window. "Do you think it will stop before my play? Tomorrow?" "I'm sure it will," I said, though the storm looked like it was settling in for a long stay. Rain never lasts forever. The weather forecast on the kitchen radio confirmed my concerns about the storm's duration. The meteorologist was describing a slow-moving weather system that would bring heavy rain and strong winds through Friday morning, with potential flooding in low-lying areas and power outages possible due to falling trees and debris. "Folks should avoid unnecessary travel tonight," the weatherman advised. "This is the kind of storm where the safest place to be is inside a sturdy building with emergency supplies readily available." I made a mental note to check the flashlights and battery-powered radio that Jessica kept in the kitchen pantry, and to make sure my cell phone was fully charged in case the power went out. The main house was well built and had weathered plenty of storms over the years, but it was always better to be prepared for extended power outages and communication disruptions. At 5:30, I drove through increasingly heavy rain to pick up Jake from Tommy's house. The roads were slick with water, and visibility was poor enough that the normally 10-minute drive took nearly 20 minutes. Jake was disappointed that his gaming session had been cut short by weather and transportation logistics, but he was philosophical about it in the way children learn to be when adult plans frequently change without their input. "Tommy's mom said I could come back this weekend if someone can drive me," Jake said as we navigated through water that was beginning to pool at intersections. "But I probably shouldn't count on it." "Why not?" I asked, though I suspected I knew the answer. "Because Mom and Dad always have stuff come up and I don't want to ask you to drive me places every weekend. You probably have your own stuff you want to do." My own stuff. Jake had learned to think about my time and interests as secondary considerations, things that mattered but not as much as family logistics and parental convenience. The fact that he was trying to protect me from excessive requests showed more consideration for my autonomy than I'd received from any adult in the family. We returned to the main house at 6:15, soaked from the brief run between the car and the front door despite the umbrella I'd brought. I helped Jake change into dry clothes while Sophie showed him the improvements she'd made to her tree performance during his absence. The house felt different with the storm raging outside, warmer and more cozy, but also more isolated. With Marcus in Seattle and Jessica still at her extended client meeting, the three of us were completely on our own in the kind of weather that made venturing outside seem inadvisable. I reheated the pot roast and vegetables I'd prepared earlier, and we ate dinner while listening to rain hammer against the roof and windows. The children were in good moods, excited about having an unexpected sleepover at the main house, and pleased to have my undivided attention for an entire evening. "This is nice," Sophie said as she helped me clear the dinner dishes. "Like when I was little and you used to babysit us overnight when Mom and Dad went on trips." "I remember those nights," I said, loading plates into the dishwasher while Sophie put leftover food into containers. "You and Jake would build blanket forts in the living room." "Can we do that tonight?" Jake asked, his eyes lighting up with the enthusiasm he usually reserved for video games and sports. "It's been forever since we built a really good fort." We spent the next hour constructing an elaborate blanket fort that stretched from the couch to the coffee table and required most of the throw pillows in the house. The children were absorbed in the project with the kind of focused creativity that reminded me why I enjoyed spending time with them, despite the circumstances that usually brought us together. By 8 p.m., we were settled inside the fort with flashlights and books, listening to the storm continue its assault on the house while feeling snug and protected in our makeshift shelter. Jake was reading a book about baseball. Sophie was drawing pictures of trees in preparation for her play, and I was finally making progress on the mystery novel I'd been trying to finish for weeks. The domestic peace of the evening was almost perfect. If you could ignore the fact that it existed only because both children's parents had prioritized professional obligations over family time, and that I was providing overnight childcare with minimal notice and no additional consideration beyond vague promises of future spa days. At 8:30, Jessica called. "Eleanor?" Her voice was bright with excitement and what sounded like restaurant noise in the background. The presentation went incredibly well, better than I'd hoped. The clients want to move forward with the full contract, and they've invited me to join them for dinner to discuss implementation details. "That's wonderful news," I said, stepping out of the blanket fort so I could speak privately. "Congratulations." "Thank you. I know this means I'll be later than I originally planned, but this is exactly the kind of opportunity I've been working toward for years. The contract alone will triple my annual revenue. Triple her annual revenue. The kind of professional success that would be celebrated in most families, but which I realized would also mean more demands on Jessica's time and more reliance on my availability to maintain household stability. "What time do you think you'll be home?" I asked, looking through the living room window at rain that showed no signs of diminishing. "Well, that's the thing," Jessica said, and I could hear her moving to a quieter location. "The dinner reservation isn't until 9 p.m., and these kinds of business dinners can run quite late. Plus, the weather is absolutely terrible. It might be safer for me to stay at the downtown hotel rather than try to drive home in this storm." Stay downtown. On the night when Marcus was in Seattle and I was responsible for overnight childcare, that had been arranged with 4 hours' notice. "Jessica," I said carefully, "are you saying you might not come home at all tonight?" "I'm saying it's a possibility I need to consider," she replied, her tone taking on the defensive quality she used when she sensed criticism. "The roads are really dangerous right now, and this business dinner could go very late. It might be more responsible to stay downtown and drive home tomorrow morning when the weather clears." More responsible. Jessica was framing her choice to extend professional networking into an overnight absence as a responsible decision about driving safety, rather than acknowledging that it left me with complete childcare responsibility during a significant storm. "What about Sophie and Jake?" I asked. "Sophie has her play tomorrow and Jake has school." "You can handle the morning routine, can't you?" Jessica asked, as if this was a minor favor rather than a significant expansion of my overnight responsibilities. "You're so good at getting them organized, and they listen to you better than they listen to me anyway." They listen to me better than they listen to me anyway. Another casual dismissal of her own parental responsibilities, disguised as a compliment about my effectiveness with the children. "Jessica, I need to be clear about what you're asking," I said, my patience finally beginning to fray around the edges. "You want me to provide overnight childcare, morning routines, school preparation, and transportation to Sophie's play, all so you can extend a business dinner into a networking sleepover?" There was a pause, and when Jessica spoke again, her voice carried an edge of irritation that suggested she wasn't accustomed to having her requests questioned. "Eleanor, this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, the kind of contract that could secure our family's financial future. I'm not extending this dinner for fun. I'm doing it because it's the smart business decision that will benefit all of us in the long run. All of us." Except apparently, it didn't include consideration for the person who would be managing all the family responsibilities that Jessica's smart business decision required her to abandon. "I understand that it's an important opportunity," I said, evenly, "but it would have been helpful to know earlier that you were considering staying downtown overnight." "I didn't know earlier," Jessica said, her tone becoming more defensive. "The opportunity for this dinner just came up, and the weather has gotten worse than anyone predicted. I'm trying to make the best decisions I can in a fluid situation." A fluid situation. Another phrase that positioned Jessica's choice as a response to circumstances beyond her control, rather than a decision to prioritize professional networking over family obligations. Fine, I said, because there was no point in continuing a conversation where my concerns were being dismissed as unreasonable. I'll handle everything here. Thank you, Jessica said, relief evident in her voice. I know it's a lot to ask, but you're the only person I trust to take care of the children. And who knows, maybe this contract will be successful enough that we can finally hire some regular help around the house. Regular help around the house, as if the issue was that Jessica needed more domestic support, rather than acknowledgement that I'd been providing that support for 5 years without compensation, consideration, or basic courtesy. After hanging up, I returned to the blanket fort where Sophie and Jake were absorbed in their respective activities. I didn't immediately tell them that their mother wouldn't be coming home, partly because I was still processing my anger about the situation, and partly because I wanted to think through how to present Jessica's absence in a way that wouldn't make the children feel abandoned or unimportant. Was that Mom? Sophie asked, looking up from her drawing. Is she coming home soon? She's still at her business dinner, I said carefully. The weather is pretty bad for driving, so she might decide to stay downtown tonight and come home tomorrow. Morning. So it's just us tonight? Jake asked, not sounding particularly disappointed by this prospect. Just us, I confirmed. Is that okay with you guys? It's perfect, Sophie said, returning to her drawing with renewed focus. I like it when it's just us. It's more fun. More fun. Sophie's casual observation that evenings with me were more enjoyable than normal family time stung more than I expected, partly because it suggested that the children had also noticed the tension and stress that characterized interactions with their parents. We spent another hour in the blanket fort, reading and talking and listening to the storm continue its assault on the house. By 9:30, both children were ready for bed, and I went through the familiar routine of supervising toothbrushing, finding pajamas, and negotiating the complex logistics of childhood bedtime preparations. As I tucked Sophie into her bed and listened to her practice her lines one more time, I found myself thinking about how natural and comfortable this evening had felt despite the circumstances that had created it. Without the stress of accommodating Jessica's schedule or managing Marcus's travel logistics, the children and I had simply enjoyed each other's company in the way that families should. Grandma Eleanor, Sophie said as I turned off her bedroom light. Will you definitely be at my play tomorrow, even if Mom and Dad can't make it? I'll definitely be there, I promised, though I realized I still didn't know the specific time or location details that I'd been meaning to confirm with Jessica for the past week. Good, Sophie said, settling into her pillow with the satisfied expression of someone whose most important concern had been addressed. You're the best audience anyway. After getting both children settled in their beds, I returned to the living room to tidy up the blanket fort and prepare for what would apparently be a full night of solo childcare responsibility. The storm was still raging outside, with rain pelting the windows and wind rattling the house in a way that made me grateful to be inside a solid, well-built structure. At 10:15, I realized I'd left my book in the guest house, along with my nighttime medications and the clothes I'd need for tomorrow morning. The guest house was only 50 yards from the main house, but getting there would require running through a downpour that had intensified significantly since dinner. I found an umbrella in the front hall closet and prepared to make a quick dash to retrieve the things I'd need for an unexpected overnight stay. The umbrella was one of those compact models that Jessica kept for emergencies, more decorative than functional, but it would have to suffice for the brief trip across the backyard. I opened the front door and was immediately struck by the force of the storm. What had seemed like heavy rain from inside the house revealed itself to be a torrential downpour, with winds strong enough to turn my inadequate umbrella inside out before I'd taken 3 steps onto the front porch. The 50-yard distance to the guest house might as well have been 50 miles in weather this severe. Visibility was nearly zero, The wind was strong enough to knock me off balance, and the amount of rain falling would soak me through in seconds regardless of my umbrella situation. I retreated to the main house, accepting that I'd have to manage, overnight, without my usual nighttime routine, and tomorrow morning without my preferred clothes. It was an inconvenience, but not a crisis. I could borrow one of Jessica's nightgowns and figure out clothing solutions in the morning. What I didn't anticipate was that my key to the main house was in my purse, which was in the guest house along with everything else I'd left behind when I'd assumed this would be a brief evening of childcare that would end when Jessica returned from her business dinner. Discovered this problem at 10:45 p.m. when I stepped onto the front porch to move my car closer to the house and realized that I'd locked myself out. The front door had closed behind me with the kind of solid click that indicated the deadbolt had engaged automatically. I tried the handle anyway, hoping that my ears had deceived me, but the door was definitely locked. I checked my pockets for keys, knowing they weren't there but hoping anyway, and confirmed that my house key was indeed in my purse in the guest house. I stood on the front porch for several minutes, getting progressively wetter despite the limited protection provided by the roof overhang, and considered my options. The children were asleep inside the house, trusting that I was nearby and available if they needed anything during the night. I was locked outside in a storm that made traveling to the guest house impossible and returning to the main house equally impossible. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on me. After spending an entire day accommodating other people's schedule changes and professional priorities, after providing extensive childcare with minimal notice and no consideration for my own plans, after agreeing to overnight responsibility when Jessica decided that business networking was more important than parenting, after all of that, I was standing outside in a thunderstorm because I'd been so focused on taking care of everyone else that I'd forgotten to take care of the basic logistics of my own situation. I tried calling Jessica, but my phone went straight to voicemail, probably because she was in a restaurant with poor reception, or because she'd turned off her phone to focus on her important business dinner. I tried calling Marcus, but his phone also went to voicemail, probably because he was asleep in Seattle, or because he'd turned off his phone for the night. I was on my own, locked out of a house where 2 children were sleeping, unable to reach the adults who were supposed to be responsible for this situation, and getting increasingly soaked by a storm that showed no signs of diminishing. For 20 minutes, I stood on that front porch, trying different ways to contact Jessica and Marcus, looking for unlocked windows or alternative entrances, and becoming progressively more angry about the circumstances that had led to this situation. I tried the back door, but it was locked as well. I checked all the first-floor windows, but Jessica was diligent about home security and everything was latched tight. I even considered trying to break into my own guest house to retrieve my keys, but the wind and rain made any extended outdoor activity dangerous, and I wasn't sure I could get back to the main house safely, even if I managed to reach the guest house. The cold was beginning to penetrate my clothes, which had been adequate for indoor childcare, but were completely inappropriate for standing outside in a storm. My shoes were soaked through, my hair was plastered to my head despite my attempts to stay under the porch overhang, and I was starting to shiver in a way that suggested hypothermia might become a concern if I remained outside much longer. When I finally saw headlights in the driveway at 11:15 p.m., I felt a surge of relief that was immediately followed by confusion. The headlights belonged to a taxi, not Jessica's SUV or a car service that might indicate Marcus had taken an earlier flight home. As the taxi got closer, I realized it was Jessica getting out of the back seat, but she appeared to be more than a little intoxicated from her business dinner. She was moving with the careful concentration of someone whose coordination had been compromised by alcohol, and she was focused on getting from the taxi to the front door with minimal exposure to the rain. "Jessica," I called out from the front porch, but my voice was lost in the sound of the storm. Jessica fumbled with her keys at the front door, just a few feet from where I was standing, but the porch overhang and the driving rain created a visual barrier that prevented her from seeing me clearly. I was standing in the shadows at the corner of the porch, and Jessica was concentrating intensely on the simple task of finding the right key and getting it into the lock. "Jessica, I'm locked out!" I called louder, stepping forward into the rain to make myself more visible. She looked up, finally noticing my presence, and for a moment I thought she was going to open the door and let me in. Instead, she looked at me with the kind of confused irritation that people display when their plans are interrupted by unexpected complications. Her eyes took a moment to focus, and I could see her trying to process the situation. Why I was standing outside in the rain, why I wasn't safely inside the house taking care of her children, why my presence was complicating her simple desire to get inside and go to bed. "What are you doing out there?" she asked, not moving to unlock the door. "I got locked out when I went to move my car," I explained, raising my voice to be heard over the storm. "My keys are in the guest house." Jessica stared at me for several seconds, as if processing this information required more cognitive effort than she could immediately muster. I watched her face as she considered my explanation, and I saw the moment when she decided that my problem was minor and easily solved. Then she shrugged with the kind of casual dismissiveness that suggested my comfort and safety were less important than her immediate desire to get inside where it was warm and dry. "Maybe next time you'll remember your keys," she said, and turned to unlock the front door. "Maybe next time you'll remember your keys." As if getting locked out while providing overnight childcare for her children was my fault rather than the predictable result of the chaotic logistics that she and Marcus had created with their last-minute schedule changes. The casual cruelty of the comment hit me harder than the physical discomfort of standing in the rain. This wasn't a moment of confusion or poor judgment brought on by alcohol. This was a deliberate choice to prioritize her own convenience over my basic safety and dignity. "Jessica, please," I said, stepping closer to the door as she prepared to enter the house. "I need to get inside. The children are in there, and I'm supposed to be taking care of them." She paused with her hand on the door handle, looking back at me with an expression that I couldn't quite read in the dim porch light. "And driving rain." For a moment, I thought she was going to invite me in, or at least acknowledge that leaving me outside in a thunderstorm was unreasonable. Instead, she shrugged again and stepped into the house. "The kids are fine," she said as she closed the door behind her. "They're asleep. I'm home now." And the door clicked shut, leaving me standing alone on the front porch in a thunderstorm, soaked to the skin and locked out of the house where I'd been providing childcare for the past 12 hours. I stood there for several more minutes, trying to process what had just happened. Jessica had seen me standing in the rain, understood that I was locked out, listened to my explanation of the situation, and chosen to leave me outside in dangerous weather rather than simply opening the door to let me in. It wasn't an oversight or a misunderstanding. It was a choice. A deliberate decision that my comfort and safety were less important than her convenience, and whatever post-dinner routine she preferred to follow without my presence. The full magnitude of my situation began to sink in as I watched the lights in the house go off one by one. Jessica was apparently preparing for bed, settling in for a comfortable night's sleep, while the woman who'd spent the day caring for her children remained, locked outside in increasingly dangerous weather. I tried knocking on the door, but there was no response. I tried calling Jessica's phone, but it went to voicemail. I tried calling the house phone, but no one answered. The lights in the house went off one by one as Jessica apparently prepared for bed, while I remained outside in a storm that was getting worse rather than better. I tried calling Marcus again, but his phone remained off or out of service. I tried calling my friend Helen, but she lived 40 minutes away and couldn't drive in this weather even if she'd been willing to venture out at midnight. I tried calling a taxi company, but they weren't sending drivers out in weather this severe. Was completely stranded, abandoned by the family I'd spent the day serving, left outside in dangerous weather by the woman whose children I'd been protecting while she networked at business dinners and decided that professional opportunities were more important than basic human decency. The temperature was dropping, and the rain was getting heavier. My clothes were soaked through, offering no protection against the cold wind that was beginning to make my entire body shake. I could feel my core temperature dropping, and I realized that hypothermia was becoming a real concern if I couldn't find shelter soon. I tried to find a more protected area of the porch, but the wind was driving rain horizontally, making it impossible to stay dry anywhere outside the house. I considered trying to break a window to get inside, but I didn't want to traumatize Sophie and Jake by waking them with the sound of breaking glass, and I wasn't sure I could explain to them why their grandmother had to break into their house. For 3 hours, I stood on that front porch, alternately trying to find shelter from the rain and attempting to contact someone who might help me resolve this situation. I called Marcus's hotel in Seattle and left messages at the front desk. I called Jessica's phone every 30 minutes, leaving increasingly desperate voicemails asking her to simply open the door and let me inside. But no one came. No one answered. No one seemed to care that a 70-year-old woman was trapped outside in a dangerous storm because the family she'd been serving had decided that her comfort and safety were less important than their own convenience. As I stood there, getting progressively colder and wetter and angrier, I had plenty of time to think about how I'd ended up in this situation, how I'd gradually allowed my own needs and boundaries to disappear in service of a family that had learned to see my availability as their entitlement. How I'd accepted smaller and smaller considerations until I'd become someone who could be left outside in a thunderstorm without a second thought. I thought about Sophie's play about the wise oak tree that provided shelter and support for the entire forest. I thought about Jake's casual observation that I was the only reliable adult in his life. I thought about the years I'd spent making myself indispensable to people who had learned to take my indispensability for granted. But most of all, I thought about Jessica's words as she closed the door and left me outside. Maybe next time you'll remember your keys. As if my situation was the result of my own poor planning rather than her family's chaotic logistics. As if my discomfort was a reasonable consequence of my own forgetfulness, rather than their failure to provide basic consideration for someone who'd spent the day solving their problems. Standing on that porch in the rain, shivering and abandoned, and furious, I finally understood the truth about my relationship with this family. I wasn't a valued grandmother or a trusted family member. I was a convenience that could be used when needed and discarded when inconvenient. But what Jessica and Marcus didn't understand was that conveniences could be withdrawn, services could be discontinued, and grandmothers who had been taken for granted could decide to stop being available for people who had forgotten how to treat them with basic human dignity. By the time the storm finally began to subside around 2 a.m., I had made a decision that would change everything about my relationship with this family. I was done being grateful for scraps. I was done accepting less than I deserved. I was done making myself smaller to accommodate people who had forgotten that I was a person worthy of consideration and respect. The rain that had soaked me to the skin had also washed away the last of my illusions about unconditional family, love, and revealed the true cost of making myself indispensable to people who saw my indispensability as their right, rather than my gift. Jessica had made her choice when she closed that door. Now it was time for me to make mine, and my choice was going to change everything. The storm finally began to subside around 2 a.m., but by then something fundamental had changed inside me that went far deeper than my soaked clothes and chattering teeth. As I stood on that porch for 3 hours, abandoned by the family I'd devoted 5 years of my life to serving, I'd had plenty of time to think about exactly how I'd allowed myself to become someone who could be left outside in a thunderstorm, without a second thought. But more importantly, I'd had time to remember who I used to be before I became the convenient grandmother who said yes to everything and expected nothing in return. I'd had time to remember Eleanor Hartwell, the woman who'd raised a son alone while working 2 jobs. The woman who'd saved every penny to ensure Marcus had opportunities I'd never had. The woman who'd built a life worth living through determination, sacrifice, and careful planning, not through making herself useful to people who had forgotten how to value what they had. As the rain lightened from torrential downpour to steady drizzle, I pulled out my phone and made a call I should have made years ago. "Helen?" I said when my oldest friend answered on the third ring, her voice thick with sleep but immediately alert when she heard my tone. "Eleanor? What's wrong?" "It's 2 a.m. Helen Morrison had been my friend for over 30 years, ever since. We'd worked together at the library when Marcus was in high school. She was the only person who remembered who I'd been before I moved to the guest house, and gradually disappeared into the role of convenient childcare provider. "Helen, I need a place to stay tonight," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "And I need you to help me do something that's going to surprise everyone." "Of course," Helen said without hesitation. "But are you all right? I sound different because I am different," I said, watching the main house where Jessica was sleeping comfortably while I remained locked outside. "I'll explain everything when I see you, but I need to know. Do you still have connections at Willowbrook Savings and Trust?" Helen had retired from the library 5 years ago and had been working part-time as a financial advisor at the local bank, helping seniors manage their investments and retirement planning. But more importantly, she knew everyone in Willowbrook's small business community, and she understood how local finances and property ownership really worked. "I do," Helen said carefully. "Eleanor, what's going on?" "I'm going to buy this house," I said, looking up at the structure that had sheltered Jessica while leaving me outside in the storm. "And then I'm going to make some changes that will help Marcus and Jessica understand exactly what they've lost." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and I could practically hear Helen processing the implications of what I'd just said. "Eleanor," she said slowly, "when you say you're going to buy the house, you mean—" "I mean I'm going to purchase the property that Marcus and Jessica think they own," I said, my mind already working through the logistics of what I was planning. "I mean, I'm going to become their landlord. And then we're going to have a conversation about respect and boundaries and what happens when you treat someone like they're disposable." The truth was, I had resources that Marcus and Jessica knew nothing about. Resources I'd been quietly building for decades while they assumed I was just the helpful grandmother who lived in the guest house and provided free services whenever needed. When Robert died, his life insurance policy had been larger than anyone. Realized $150,000 that I'd invested carefully over the years instead of spending on luxuries or travel. When I sold my original house to move to the guest house, I'd netted another $80,000 that I'd added to my investment portfolio. The rental property I'd bought in my old neighborhood had been providing steady income for 15 years and was now worth 3 times what I'd paid for it. Most importantly, I'd been managing my finances with the same careful attention to detail that I'd once brought to raising Marcus and running a household on limited resources. While Jessica spent money on yoga classes and boutique shopping, and Marcus focused on career advancement and business networking, I'd been building wealth quietly and systematically. I had enough money to make Marcus and Jessica's financial life very interesting. I just hadn't realized until tonight that I might need to use it to teach them some lessons about treating people with basic human dignity. "Helen," I said, making my way carefully off the porch and toward my car. "I need you to pick me up from the corner of Oak and Maple Street. I'll wait in my car until you get there. And tomorrow morning, I need you to help me contact a real estate lawyer and a property appraiser." "Eleanor, are you sure about this?" Helen asked. But I could hear her moving around what I assumed was her bedroom, getting dressed for a middle-of-the-night rescue mission. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," I said, starting my car and feeling grateful that it started despite having sat in the storm for hours. "Helen, they left me outside in a thunderstorm. After I spent the entire day taking care of their children and managing their household, Jessica looked at me standing in the rain and decided it was easier to leave me outside than to turn a key in a lock." I could hear Helen's sharp intake of breath as she processed what I'd told her. "They left you outside, in this storm?" "For 3 hours, I confirmed, driving slowly through the flooded streets toward our meeting point. And when I asked Jessica to let me in, she told me that maybe next time I'd remember my keys. As if getting locked out while providing overnight. Childcare was my fault rather than the result of their chaotic family management. Eleanor, Helen said, her voice carrying the steel that I remembered from her days managing difficult library patrons. Let's go buy a house. Helen picked me up at the corner of Oak and Maple at 2:45 a.m., and I spent the 20-minute drive to her house explaining everything that had led to this moment. The gradual erosion of boundaries, the casual assumptions about my availability, the way I'd been relegated to the role of convenient problem solver while being excluded from anything that resembled actual family inclusion. But mostly, I told her about Jessica's face when she chose to leave me outside. The deliberate decision to prioritize her own comfort over my basic safety. The casual cruelty that revealed exactly how little my well-being mattered to the people I'd been serving. The question is, Helen said as we pulled into her driveway, what exactly do you want to accomplish? Because buying their house is just the beginning. The real power is in what you do with it afterward. Helen had always been the strategic thinker in our friendship, the one who could see 3 moves ahead in complex situations. That's why she'd been successful as a financial advisor. She understood that money was just a tool, and that real power came from understanding how to use that tool to create the outcomes you wanted. I want them to understand what they've lost, I said, accepting the hot coffee and warm bathrobe that Helen offered as we settled into her kitchen. I want them to realize that treating me like I'm disposable was the biggest mistake they've ever made. And then what? Helen asked. Do you want them to apologize and change their behavior? Do you want revenge? Do you want to punish them? Because the strategy changes depending on your ultimate goal. I thought about that as I sipped Helen's coffee and felt warmth returning to my body for the first time in hours. What did I want? Justice? Revenge? Recognition? An apology that actually meant something? I want them to need me more than I need them, I said finally. I want to flip the power dynamic so that my approval and cooperation become things they have to earn instead of things they can take for granted. Helen nodded, pulling out a legal pad and beginning to make notes. Then we need to think about this systematically, she said. Buying the house gives you leverage, but leverage is only powerful if you know how to use it. We need to understand their vulnerabilities, their dependencies, their pressure points. Over the next 3 hours, Helen and I developed a comprehensive plan that would give me control over every aspect of Marcus and Jessica's comfortable life. It started with the house, but it extended far beyond property ownership into the realm of social, financial, and professional consequences. The house was the foundation of everything. Marcus and Jessica believed they owned their beautiful colonial, with the wraparound porch and perfect landscaping. What they didn't realize was that they'd purchased it with a balloon mortgage that would come due in 18 months, a financial arrangement that had seemed smart when Marcus's career was advancing rapidly and Jessica's consulting business was growing. But balloon mortgages were dangerous financial instruments that required either refinancing or a large lump sum payment when they matured. In the current economic climate, with Marcus's company downsizing and Jessica's business still trying to establish consistent revenue, refinancing might be difficult and expensive. If someone with excellent credit and significant assets wanted to purchase that mortgage from the current lender, Helen explained, they could essentially become the bank, which means they'd have the power to approve or deny refinancing, set new terms and interest rates, and ultimately foreclose if payments weren't made. Becoming their mortgage holder would give me more power over their lives than simply owning the house outright. It would make me their financial lifeline, the person they'd have to negotiate with, please, and maintain a positive relationship with if they wanted to keep their home. But the house was just the beginning. Marcus's job at the logistics company was secure as long as the company remained profitable. But Helen's connections in the local business community had revealed some interesting information about their recent struggles. The company was considering relocating their regional office to reduce costs, which would either require Marcus to relocate his family or find new employment in an increasingly competitive market. Jessica's consulting business was more vulnerable than she'd probably admitted to Marcus. Her client base was small and concentrated in the local restaurant industry, which was notoriously unstable. Most of her revenue came from 3 major accounts, and losing any one of them would create serious financial pressure. The thing about small business consulting, Helen observed, is that success depends heavily on reputation and word-of-mouth referrals. If key clients started questioning a consultant's reliability or professionalism, it could seriously damage their ability to attract new business. Helen's network in the local business community was extensive, and she knew the owners of 2 of Jessica's 3 major accounts. She also knew the president of the Willowbrook Chamber of Commerce, the head of the Business Development Association, and several other influential figures who could affect Jessica's professional reputation. "I'm not suggesting we sabotage her business," Helen clarified. "But if certain people began asking questions about Jessica's family values, her reliability in crisis situations, or her treatment of elderly family members, well, that's the kind of reputation issue that can be very difficult to recover from." By 6 a.m., we had a comprehensive plan that would systematically transfer power from Marcus and Jessica to me, while giving them multiple opportunities to change their behavior and earn their way back into my good graces. The first phase would be financial, purchasing their mortgage and becoming their creditor. The second phase would be social, making sure that key people in their professional and social networks understood how Jessica had treated me. The third phase would be residential, using my position as their mortgage holder to make living in, the house conditional on treating me with appropriate respect and consideration. "The beauty of this approach," Helen said as we finalized the details, "is that it's entirely legal and ethical. You're not doing anything vindictive or cruel. You're simply using your own resources to create a situation where they have to treat you with the respect you've always deserved." At 7 a.m., I called Marcus's hotel in Seattle and asked to be connected to his room. "Mom?" Marcus's voice was groggy with sleep and confusion. "What's wrong? Is everything okay with the kids?" "The children are fine," I said calmly, "but we need to talk. I'm calling to let you know that I'll be moving out of the guest house today." There was a pause as Marcus processed this information. "Moving out? What do you mean? Where are you going?" "I'm going to be staying with Helen Morrison for the foreseeable future," I said. "I've decided that the current living arrangement isn't working for me anymore." "Mom, what happened? Is this about last night? Jessica said there was some confusion about keys." "Some confusion about keys." That's how Jessica had described leaving me outside in a thunderstorm for 3 hours. "Marcus," I said, my voice taking on the same tone I'd used when he was 12 years old and had tried to lie about breaking a neighbor's window. "Jessica left me locked outside in a dangerous storm for 3 hours. When I asked her to let me inside the house where I was supposed to be caring for your children, she told me that maybe next time I'd remember my keys." The silence that followed was so long that I wondered if the call had been disconnected. "What?" Marcus finally said, his voice small and disbelieving. "She made a choice, Marcus. When presented with the option of showing basic human kindness to your mother or prioritizing her own convenience, she chose convenience. And you weren't there to protect me because you'd prioritized your career advancement over family responsibilities." "Mom, I'm sure there's been some misunderstanding." "The only misunderstanding," I interrupted, "is the one I've been living with for 5 years. The misunderstanding that made me think I was a valued member of this family instead of a convenient service provider who could be discarded when inconvenient." I could hear Marcus breathing on the other end of the line, processing the implications of what I was telling him. "What do you want me to do?" he asked finally. "I want you to understand that actions have consequences," I said. "I want you to realize that the woman who raised you alone, who sacrificed everything to give you opportunities, who moved to your guest house to help with your children. That woman deserves better treatment than she's been receiving." "Of course. You do," Marcus said quickly. "Mom, we can fix this. Whatever went wrong last night, we can work it out." "Marcus," I said gently, "some things can't be fixed. They can only be learned from. And the lesson here is that relationships have to be based on mutual respect and consideration, not on one person's unconditional availability to solve everyone else's problems." After hanging up with Marcus, I called Sophie and Jake's school to let them know that I wouldn't be available for pickup or any other assistance for the foreseeable future. I called Helen's contact at Willowbrook Savings and Trust to schedule an emergency meeting about purchasing a mortgage. I called a moving company to arrange for my belongings to be transferred from the guest house to Helen's spare room. And then, I called Jessica. "Eleanor?" Jessica's voice was thick with sleep and what sounded like a significant hangover from her business dinner. "Where are you? The kids are asking." "I'm not available for childcare today," I said calmly. "Or any other day for that matter. I've decided to withdraw my services from your family." "What do you mean withdraw your services? You live here?" "I live there," I corrected. "Past tense. I'm moving out today." There was a pause as Jessica tried to process this information through what I assumed was considerable alcohol-induced fog. "Eleanor, I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding about last night." "There's been no misunderstanding," I said. "You made a conscious choice to leave me outside in a dangerous storm rather than turn a key in a lock. That choice revealed exactly how much my well-being matters to you, and I've decided to organize my life accordingly." "Look, I was tired and maybe a little drunk and I wasn't thinking clearly." "Jessica," I interrupted, "the time for explanations and excuses has passed. The time for consequences has arrived." I hung up before she could respond, and immediately called the moving company to confirm that they could begin transferring my belongings within 2 hours. By noon, Helen and I were sitting in the offices of Willowbrook Savings and Trust, meeting with the bank president and the mortgage department supervisor about purchasing Marcus and Jessica's balloon mortgage. The process was more complicated than simply buying a house, but it was entirely legal and surprisingly straightforward for someone with my credit rating and available assets. "The current mortgage holder is actually eager to sell," the bank president explained. "Balloon mortgages have become liability concerns in the current economic climate, and financial institutions are increasingly interested in transferring that risk to private investors." The purchase price was $240,000, significantly less than the house's current market value, but appropriate for the outstanding balance on a loan that would mature in 18 months. I would become the mortgage holder, with all the rights and responsibilities that entailed, including the power to approve or deny refinancing applications when the balloon payment came due. "This gives you considerable leverage," the mortgage supervisor explained as we reviewed the paperwork. "The borrowers will need to maintain current payments, keep the property in good condition, and demonstrate creditworthiness when they apply for refinancing. If they default on any of these obligations, you have the right to initiate foreclosure proceedings." By 3 p.m., I was the proud owner of Marcus and Jessica's mortgage, with legal authority over their housing security and financial future. But more importantly, I was no longer the powerless grandmother who could be locked outside in storms and expected to accept whatever treatment her family chose to provide. Helen and I celebrated with lunch at Riverside Restaurant, the same upscale establishment, where Jessica had conducted her important business dinner, while I stood outside in the rain. As we reviewed the mortgage documents over expertly prepared seafood, I felt a satisfaction that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with finally having the power to demand the respect I'd always deserved. "So what's the next step?" Helen asked as we finished our meal. "Now we wait," I said, looking out the restaurant's windows at the town where I'd lived my entire life. "We wait for Marcus and Jessica to realize that their comfortable life depends on maintaining a positive relationship with someone they've been taking for granted." The first indication that my message had been received came at 4:30 p.m. when my phone rang with a call from Marcus. "Mom, I just got off the plane and Jessica told me you moved out," he said without preamble. "She said you're upset about something that happened last night, but she's not making much sense. Can we please talk about this like adults?" "Of course we can talk like adults," I said pleasantly. "Why don't you and Jessica come to Helen's house at 7 p.m.? We have some things to discuss about your mortgage and housing situation." "Our mortgage? What does our mortgage have to do with anything?" "You'll understand when you get here," I said, giving him Helen's address. "And Marcus? You might want to bring a calculator." Marcus and Jessica arrived at Helen's house at exactly 7 p.m., both looking stressed and confused in a way that suggested they'd spent the afternoon trying to understand how their reliable, compliant mother and mother-in-law had suddenly become someone who moved out without warning and made mysterious comments about mortgages. Helen had prepared her living room for what she called a negotiation session, with chairs arranged around, her coffee table and the mortgage documents organized in neat folders. She'd also prepared coffee and cookies because, as she pointed out, even hostile negotiations benefit from good hospitality. "Mom," Marcus said as soon as they were seated, "I need you to help me understand what's happening here. Jessica says you were locked out last night, but..." "But what, Marcus?" I asked, settling into my chair and accepting the cup of coffee that Helen offered. "But you find it hard to believe that your wife would leave your mother outside in a dangerous storm? But you think there must be some reasonable explanation for why I spent 3 hours on your front porch getting soaked to the skin while Jessica slept comfortably in your warm, dry house?" Jessica shifted uncomfortably in her chair, avoiding eye contact with everyone in the room. "Jessica," I continued, "would you like to explain to Marcus exactly what happened when you came home last night?" "I was tired," Jessica said defensively, "and I'd had some wine with dinner, and I wasn't thinking clearly. I didn't realize—" "You didn't realize what?" I asked calmly. "You didn't realize that leaving a 70-year-old woman outside in a thunderstorm was dangerous? You didn't realize that I'd been providing childcare for your children all day? You didn't realize that basic human decency requires helping people who are trapped in bad weather?" "I made a mistake," Jessica said, her voice small and strained. "I'm sorry. I was drunk and tired and I made a bad decision." "You made a choice," I corrected. "A choice that revealed exactly how much my well-being matters to you. A choice that showed me who you really are when common courtesy conflicts with your personal convenience." Marcus was looking back and forth between Jessica and me, trying to process the implications of what he was hearing. "Mom, if Jessica made a mistake, we can address that," he said carefully. "But moving out seems like an extreme response." "Marcus," I said, opening one of the folders that Helen had prepared, "let me show you something that might help you understand the situation more clearly." I spread the mortgage documents across the coffee table, watching as Marcus and Jessica recognized their own names on the legal paperwork. "This is your mortgage," I said conversationally. "Or rather, it was your mortgage until this afternoon, when I purchased it from Willowbrook Savings and Trust." The silence that followed was profound. I could see both Marcus and Jessica trying to process what I'd just told them, trying to understand how their mortgage had somehow become their mortgage held by me. "You purchased our mortgage," Marcus said slowly. "I did," I confirmed. "Which means that I'm now your creditor. Your monthly payments come to me. Your refinancing application will be submitted to me. And if you default on your obligations, I have the authority to foreclose on your home." Jessica had gone very pale, and I could see her hands shaking as she reached for her coffee cup. "Eleanor," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "you can't be serious." "I'm completely serious," I said. "Helen, would you explain the legal implications?" Helen opened her own folder and began reviewing the documentation with the professional competence that had made her successful as a financial advisor. "Eleanor is now the holder of your balloon mortgage," Helen explained. The outstanding balance is $240,000, with monthly payments of $1,850 due on the first of each month. The balloon payment of the full remaining balance comes due in 18 months, at which point you'll need to either pay off the loan entirely or apply for refinancing. But we planned to refinance through the bank, Marcus said, his voice carrying a note of panic that I'd never heard before. And you still can apply for refinancing, Helen continued. But your application will be reviewed by Eleanor, who has full discretionary authority to approve or deny your request based on your payment history, creditworthiness, and overall relationship with your creditor. The implications were sinking in now. I could see Marcus and Jessica beginning to understand that their housing security, their financial stability, and their ability to maintain their comfortable lifestyle now depended on maintaining a positive relationship with the woman they'd been taking for granted. "What do you want from us?" Jessica asked, her voice small and frightened. "I want what I've always wanted," I said calmly. "Respect, consideration, the basic courtesy that should exist between family members who care about each other." "We do care about you," Marcus said quickly. "Mom, you have to know that we love you and appreciate everything you do for us." "Marcus," I said gently, "if you love and appreciate me, why did you structure your lives around the assumption that my time was infinitely available? Why did you accept last-minute schedule changes that required me to provide childcare with no advance notice? Why did you never ask what I wanted or needed in return for all the support I provided?" Marcus had no answer for that, and I could see him struggling to reconcile his stated love and appreciation with his actual behavior over the past 5 years. "And Jessica," I continued, "if you care about me, how do you explain leaving me outside in a dangerous storm? How do you justify prioritizing your comfort over my safety? How do you reconcile claiming to care about someone while treating them as disposable?" Jessica was crying now, quiet tears that I might have found touching if I hadn't spent 3 hours shivering on her front porch. "I was wrong," she said through her tears. "I was selfish and cruel, and I treated you terribly. I don't know how to make it right." "The first step in making it right," I said, "is understanding what went wrong. And what went wrong is that both of you forgot that I'm a person with my own needs, interests, and right to consideration. You turned me into a convenience, a resource to be used when needed and ignored when not." I pulled out another folder and spread its contents across the table: bank statements, investment portfolios, property deeds, and financial documents that represented 40 years of careful money management and strategic planning. "You assumed that I was financially dependent on your generosity," I said, watching their eyes widen as they processed the scope of my assets. "You assumed that I needed to live in your guest house because I couldn't afford alternatives. You assumed that I provided childcare and household support because I was grateful for whatever role you allowed me to play in your lives." The documentation showed investment accounts worth over $400,000, a rental property valued at $180,000, and liquid assets that exceeded Marcus's annual salary. I wasn't a poor grandmother dependent on my family's charity. I was a woman of independent means who had chosen to make herself available to support people she loved. "All these years," Marcus said, staring at the financial documents, "you could have lived anywhere, done anything." "I chose to live near you," I said. "I chose to help with Sophie and Jake. I chose to provide support and assistance whenever you needed it. But choice requires that alternatives exist, and respect requires that choices be acknowledged and appreciated rather than taken for granted." I closed the folders and looked directly at both Marcus and Jessica. "Here's what's going to happen," I said. "You're going to continue making your mortgage payments to me on time every month. You're going to maintain the property in good condition. And when your balloon payment comes due in 18 months, you're going to submit a refinancing application that I'll review based on your creditworthiness and our relationship." "And if we meet those obligations?" Marcus asked. "If you meet those obligations, And if you demonstrate that you've learned to treat me with appropriate respect and consideration, I'll approve your refinancing at fair market rates, I said. If you don't meet those obligations, or if you continue to treat me as a convenience rather than a person, I'll exercise my rights as your creditor. What does appropriate respect and consideration mean? Jessica asked. It means including me in family decisions that affect my life, I said. It means asking rather than assuming when you need my help. It means valuing my time and energy, as much as you value your own. It means treating me like a family member rather than hired help. And if we do that, Marcus asked, if we change and prove that we've learned from this, then we can rebuild our relationship on a foundation of mutual respect instead of my unconditional availability, I said. Then we can be a family where everyone's needs matter, where boundaries are respected, and where love is demonstrated through consideration rather than expectation. I stood up, signaling that the formal negotiation was complete. You have 18 months to figure out whether you want me as a family member or as a creditor, I said. The choice is entirely yours. Marcus and Jessica left Helen's house in subdued silence, carrying copies of the mortgage documents and a new understanding of the power dynamics in our family relationship. As I watched them walk to their car, I felt a satisfaction that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with finally having the tools to demand the respect I'd always deserved. Over the following weeks, the changes in Marcus and Jessica's behavior were dramatic and immediate. They began calling to ask if I was available before assuming I could provide childcare. They started including me in family plans and social activities. They began treating my time and energy as valuable resources rather than unlimited commodities. The mortgage payments arrived on time every month, accompanied by handwritten notes updating me on family activities and expressing gratitude for my past support. Jessica enrolled in counseling to address what she described as entitlement issues and boundary problems. Marcus began scheduling his business travel around my availability, rather than assuming I'd accommodate his schedule. Most importantly, they both began treating me like a person whose opinions mattered, whose feelings required consideration, and whose presence was valued rather than simply useful. 6 months after the night I stood outside in the rain, Sophie performed in her school play about the wise oak tree that provided shelter and support for the entire forest. This time, both parents attended, along with me, and afterward we celebrated at dinner together, a family gathering where everyone's preferences were considered and everyone's contributions were acknowledged. Grandma Eleanor, Sophie said as we shared dessert. I'm glad you moved back to your own house. You seem happier now. She was right. I was happier, but not because I'd moved to a different location. I was happier because I'd finally learned the difference between being needed and being valued, between being helpful and being used, between being a convenience and being a person. The rain that had soaked me to the skin that Thursday night had washed away more than just my clothes and comfort. It had washed away my illusions about unconditional service and revealed the truth about healthy family relationships. That love without respect is exploitation, that help without appreciation is servitude, and that sometimes the people who claim to love you need to learn how much they need you before they can learn how to value you. Jessica had told me that maybe next time I'd remember my keys. What she didn't understand was that I'd finally remembered something far more important. I'd remembered my worth, and once you remember your worth, you never forget to demand the respect you deserve. The mortgage would be paid off in 12 more months, assuming Marcus and Jessica continued to meet their obligations and demonstrate appropriate appreciation for my presence in their lives. But the real transformation was already complete. I was no longer the disposable grandmother who could be locked outside in storms and expected to accept whatever treatment my family chose to provide. I was Eleanor Hartwell, a woman of independent means and considerable power, who had chosen to use that power to teach some important lessons about dignity, respect, and the true cost of taking people for granted. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you turns out to be the best thing that could have happened. Jessica thought she was putting me in my place when she left me outside in the rain. Instead, she showed me exactly where my place really was, not as the grateful recipient of other people's tolerance, but as the architect of my own power and the guardian of my own dignity. If someone in your life is treating you like you don't matter, maybe it's time to show them exactly how much you do. Maybe it's time to stop being grateful for scraps and start demanding the feast you've earned. Because respect isn't a gift. It's a requirement. And sometimes the only way to teach people your worth is to show them the cost of losing you. What's your story? Share it in the comments below. And remember to like and subscribe for more stories about turning your worst day into your biggest victory. You're never too old, never too late, never too powerless to rewrite your story. Sometimes you just need the right motivation to begin. Up. Next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.